Good morning, everybody. I hope that this finds you well. I know for many people, including me, it's half term this week. So yeah, it's been a different kind of morning for me already. And yes, it's a interesting, I suppose, real life experience in the moment, because we are talking today about how to develop more self-compassion. And so normally I feel much more prepared and calm and with my notes and everything for these talks. And of course, it's half term, and my little one has been a little bit poorly recently and not sleeping so well. And there's logistical issues that came out of the blue at about 8 o'clock this morning. And I guess this just taps into what I wanted to talk about today, which is how to how to develop a bit more self-love and acceptance and compassion, because it's very common in these sort of situations, for us to turn that on ourselves a bit and be a bit self-critical. And it's kind of where I wanted to start today, is about, because I think this is where we enter that whole area about self-love and self-compassion, is we have to look at what's in the way of that. And often it's our own inner critic, that kind of critical voice that is telling us that we're not good enough, we haven't tried hard enough, could have done better. So there's a lot of those kind of voices that come up, and it's something that I notice a lot in teachers that I work with on my trainings, things that I see in other Facebook groups with posts around that. There's often a lot of self-criticism that tends to go on. And I guess this can come in lots of different ways. And so just inviting you to see if any of these things resonate with you as areas that you might be more prone to slip into, either criticizing yourself or feeling that you need to do more for other people. So I guess in some ways at the root of it for a lot of us is that generally as women, we tend to feel responsible for other people. So we take on those roles of caring for other people. And even if you don't have a direct caring role in your life in terms of caring for a family member or being a parent, we often are people who want to make things better for other people. And I think then this doubles with us as yoga teachers, because we tend to get into this profession for the most part to help other people. So we're already kind of wired to be of service to others and feel like we want to be helpful. And then on top of that, we then tend to feel that if something goes wrong, it's our fault. So we take on that responsibility. So, if one of our students doesn't enjoy the class or is in a bad mood, or says something directly about what they're not happy with, quite often there might be that initial reaction of like, oh no, I haven't been a good enough teacher, or I should have preempted that, or I need to make it better for this person. And then we might go away from an interaction sort of berating ourselves for not having done a good enough job in our own eyes, or feeling like somehow we should have known in advance what this person might have found annoying and fix the problem before it even arose. So those sorts of things can come up for people. I know they've come up for me in the past, and I imagine I'm probably not the only person that happens to. So that's one way where we can sort of start to kind of feed that critical voice. And when we're looking at more self-compassion, it would be to step outside of that situation almost as an onlooker. And, if you were your own best friend, or if your best friend was there watching that interaction or that scenario, what would they say? What would their view of it be? And quite often, or if we were watching someone else in that situation, we might have a very different opinion of them as to what we would criticize ourselves for. So often we seem to hold ourselves to much higher standards than we do other people. And when we start to notice that, there's a level of being unreasonable with ourselves, to hold unreasonable expectations. And so it's really good to start to be aware of that. And when that creeps in, then that is the time where we need to start to do some of these practices around self-compassion, self-love, and acceptance, because there's a real difference, and this is a real kind of nuance to become more aware of. There's a real difference between a critique and criticism. So absolutely, as a professional, we may want to review and maybe critique our last term of classes, and in that very very calm way, just look at, okay, well, what went really well? What didn't go so well? Would it work better in a different order? Is that kind of review, and that kind of critique about what's working, what's not working, how can we improve? That's really valuable. And I think it is important as professionals that we have that ongoing review, that we're not resting on our laurels. And this is where the challenge comes in, because it's so easy then for that to slide into being overly critical. So it's looking out for those voices that seem really unreasonable about what they're asking of ourselves. And if we're expecting more of ourselves than we expect of other people, that could be a little sign that this is veering into that inner critic taking over, rather than us holding ourselves accountable. So these things are always a little bit of a sliding scale, where things can sort of veer one way or another. And it's that ongoing challenge to hold that middle line as we're wanting to improve and grow and develop and be accountable and take responsibility where it's due, but to not take on everybody's issues and be responsible for everything. So then that takes a little bit of time and self-awareness. So there's a whole area there where that critical voice can come in. I think as specifically as yoga teachers as well, we have another layer of expectation about how we're meant to be as humans. And it may be something that we've internalized as well. And I know for me, something I have to be mindful of from time to time. And because yoga isn't just exercise, it's this personal development, spiritual development. There's the philosophy and the lifestyle and everything that goes with it, which can be absolutely wonderful and a really good guide for living a happier, healthier life. But there is a risk then that there's this expectation that to be a genuine, authentic, real proper yoga teacher, we have to kind of have this level of enlightenment, or to be somehow better than the average person, um, to always be emotionally balanced, to not lose our temper, to not fall into despair, to sort of not have a normal range of human reactions, particularly in more extreme circumstances. And yes, of course, our practice does help us with all of this. And I know it's helped me enormously. But in my experience, it's more helped me process the emotions when they come up and frame things in a way that is more constructive for me. It doesn't stop the emotion coming, and I don't think I would want it to, because for me, that's part of being human. And I also feel my emotions tell me something. So, and I think this idea is also reinforced with, from the general public. I mean, the amount of times people have said to me, "Oh, you must be such an amazing mother. I bet you're never stressed. I bet you never get angry. You never say the wrong thing." And it's like, well, of course I do, because I'm human. And in the moment, when you're pushed and pushed and pushed and you haven't slept for ages and things get under your skin, of course, we have these human reactions, but it's about what we do with that and how we frame it, and how we manage those relationships and the way that we communicate. And so we kind of get this pressure from other people when we talk about being a yoga teacher, and there's this expectation that we're somehow zen all the time and kind of superhuman. And I think sometimes we put it on each other a bit too. I have seen in discussions in other Facebook groups, there's a bit of judgment going around about, who is a real yoga teacher, and, some judgment about how people have, there might be a discussion about an issue with a student, and some of the conversation around that can be a bit judgmental about how that teacher is feeling or behaving. So certainly we can give some advice or a perspective, but this idea that somehow, we have to be this very enlightened person, that doesn't get affected by things. Like, I just want to tell you that it's okay to be affected by things. And we use our yoga tools to process those feelings. And in smaller ways, we may gradually be less triggered by certain things. We can certainly work on that within ourselves. But I think this is where, being really clear on our boundaries is really important. That this is something where, I can't remember which podcast it was, but they said within it, when they'd done this deep research on like the most compassionate people, and the thing they all had in common was really strong, clear boundaries. This is my stuff. This is your stuff. And so I think this is one way that we can really practice self-love and self-compassion, is to be really clear about what your boundaries are. And when they're breached and we have an emotional reaction, that is okay. And I think, my interpretation is those emotions we have when our boundaries are breached are just like little flags going up. It's our sentinels on our boundaries going, we've had a breach. So if you feel a bit upset or a bit angry or something feels unfair, that could be a sign that your boundary is being breached. And so, then we are well within our rights, and I would say within our duty, to hold those boundaries in a really compassionate way, and not take on someone else's stuff. So rather than that critical voice, if somebody has a complaint about our payment policy or whatever, or they're wanting to push boundaries a little bit, that we have compassion for ourselves and for the other person, but that kind of self-love, which is you're allowed to have your boundaries, you're allowed to take care of yourself. It's not your job to let people walk all over you and serve them endlessly and trying to make them happy and having no boundaries. And in the long run, that doesn't serve the other person either, because actually you're taking away the opportunity for them to work on their own issues and for them to develop their own self-responsibility or whatever it is that's going on for them. So being really clear on your boundaries is a really good way to practice self-love and to give yourself permission. Say, no, I am allowed to say no to this thing, or actually, that's not my responsibility. So whether it's doing a particular task and someone might be complaining that this thing hasn't been done, and say, well, that's actually not my job to do that, or it's not my responsibility, that belongs to somebody else. And so with that, we can just start to push back a little bit on that inner critic who might be saying, oh yeah, maybe I should, or they're really upset, it's my job to fix it. You say, well, but is it? And I think that sort of brings on another little point is, when we have that critical voice that comes in that says you haven't done something well enough, or you've neglected to do something that you should have been doing, or whatever kind of negative self-talk there is, I think it's really helpful to stop before you react and just ask, is that true? Is it true that you are the person who upset this other person, or that your class wasn't good enough, or you cued in a really unhelpful way, or even suggested something dangerous, like whatever this this kind of critical voice is, just pause and go, well, let's just stop for a minute and go, is that true? Is that true what my inner voice is saying? Is that true what this other person is saying? And 9 times out of 10, it's not actually true. And when we drop into those, like we all have bad days, and might feel things are a bit hopeless, or we might spiral into a bit of self-hatred in some ways. The way that we can talk to ourselves can often be ways that we would never talk to other people. And I think just stopping that train of thought and go, hang on a minute, is it true? Is it true that I always do, or I never do, or things are never going to change, or those sorts of things, or I always make this same mistake? I think, first of all, just asking, is that true? And often it's not. It's just how you feel at the moment. So taking a little pause, and soon as you stop and realize actually it's not even true, then that often in a positive way can derail that train of thought that's taking you into a worse and worse frame of mind. But then I think what can follow that, and I know sometimes it has for me as well, is, and it gets back to that idea of like being this enlightened teacher, is like, why did I even get onto that train of thought in the first place? Like, I should know better. I've done all this training. I know all these tools. How did I allow my mind to go there? And again, I think it's treating yourself like your own best friend and going, well, we're human. This is part of being human. And sometimes these things happen. And actually, just to give yourself words of understanding, compassion, and love in the way that you would to your best friend who was having a really bad day. And you can imagine them coming home from work. They've had a really bad day in the office, and they got their head in their hands, and they're going, oh, I really messed up. I'm never going to fix this. My boss hates me. My career's finished. I don't know what I'm going to do. They You see how these thoughts can come in, and when we see it in someone else, we'd put our arm around them and just say, look, it's been a bad day. A lot of these statements aren't true. Let's look at all your strengths, all your abilities. Let's look at this situation and break it down a little bit. Let's maybe look at some practical steps. But that reassurance of you're just having this emotional outpouring, and that's normal, healthy, human, and you're allowed to do that, and I'm here with you, and we'll get through this and it'll be okay. And if we can do that for ourselves as much as possible, then I think that can go a long way to getting us out of this self-critical mode. Because in a bigger picture, when we think about a sustainable business practice, when we're in the habit of these kind of very critical, judgmental, kind of undermining ways of thinking about ourselves and our abilities, it it leads into behavior that will keep you small, that will keep your business small, because there are these voices saying, but I'm not good enough. I'm never going to whatever, finish the sentence. Or I always do this, or I never do that. So always, never, and should are three words again that should ring alarm bells. If you find yourself saying that to yourself, then always and never are pretty much never true, to use the words. And should, it's often around boundary issues. So I think when we look at those things and just treat ourselves with a little bit more self-compassion, allow ourselves to make mistakes. And so, yeah, maybe sometimes we do mess up. Maybe we have done something that's less than ideal. That doesn't mean then that that's evidence that you're the worst yoga teacher ever and really you shouldn't be teaching anymore. Or that you shouldn't try to grow your business, or that you shouldn't put yourself out there as a specialist or an expert in your field. All experts make mistakes from time to time. Even the most competent, most qualified, Nobel Prize winning scientists, whatever, everybody makes mistakes from time to time. So seeing that in a more compassionate way of evidence of just being human, and those mistakes are opportunities for learning, and you learn from it and you move on. And if there are ways that you can prevent those mistakes happening again, then that's fantastic. But to not take those things as a stick to beat yourself with, because again, there's a phrase actually that's been coming up, because I guess it's Valentine's tomorrow as well. And I remember from watching RuPaul's Drag Race, they always have the phrase, that you have to love yourself, because if you can't love yourself, how on earth are you going to love anyone else? And so again, there's that idea of, if we do want to be loving, giving, compassionate people, we have to show that to ourselves too. You know, we need to practice that within ourselves to be able to share that with other people. So it's not about shirking responsibility or making excuses, but just being really compassionate that we are human, we are allowed to have a full range of emotions, we're allowed sometimes to make mistakes and learn from them, and that we don't have to be perfect all the time, and that if we don't meet our unreasonable expectations, that we start self-flagellating. You know, that's not the branch of yoga that I'm into for sure. Um, and and I guess as a last point on a bit more of a practical level as well, um, I think around being self-employed, and in a practical way, that does often mean that we are literally responsible for everything because we're every department in our business. And this is where, if we have unreasonable expectations of our workload and all the different things that we're supposed to be doing, then this in its way can set us up for failure. If we're asking too much of ourselves, and trying to do everything all the time, it's not really sustainable. So I think as another practical and again compassionate thing, just think, what is a reasonable amount of work to ask yourself to do? How much time and energy do you really have? And just look at what can you delegate, what can you simplify, and what can you let go of. And that also is about that self-compassion, because again, if we have in our minds all the should, but you know, to be a good teacher I should, you know, this massive list of stuff. And yeah, as being self-employed people, it's not just about the teaching, it's all our admin and our marketing and the accounts and CPD and keeping all our paperwork up to date and dealing with inquiries and all of these other things that are going on. So again, with compassion, look at your situation, which is unique to you, look at the time and energy you have, and what your priorities are, and just see where you can lighten your load a little. So rather than feeling like you have to do everything, could other people do jobs for you? Are there some things you can delegate? Are there some things you can outsource and pay a little bit for somebody to help you with something? Are there things that you can just streamline or automate, like automated booking systems? And just looking at how you can lighten your load a little bit, rather than that self-critical, but I should be doing these things, or it has to be like this to be proper. Just as I say, being a bit kind to yourself in the way that you would be kind to your friends, and not ask them to do unreasonable things and then tell them that they're a failure if they haven't done them. So I think, as a summary, because I realized there were a lot of different points there, to look out for those thoughts that come in that have the words always, never, and should. They could be little flags around this is veering into self-criticism rather than being helpful. And then stopping to ask, is it true? So that can also be a good pause before we sort of spiral into a lot of self-criticism. Be clear on your boundaries and your responsibilities, and that really helps with knowing what is someone else's stuff and what's your stuff. So what really is your responsibility, and those times you can say, it's really unfortunate and I feel sorry for that person, but that's not my responsibility. And just to treat yourself like your own best friend. So if you're giving yourself a hard time, just stop and think, what would I say to my best friend if he or she were in this situation? And see if you can do a little bit of that for yourself. So I hope you find that helpful. Um, do feel free to pop some comments and just below the video on our Facebook group, because it's always lovely to hear if there's any little insights or little aha moments of like, oh yes, that's me. I tend to do that to myself. Because then I think it's also helpful for other people to know that they're not the only ones who are in this situation. And that's also why I wanted to do this talk as well, is to say, yeah, me too. I very much have to work a lot on quieting down that inner critic, because it will get in the way of your life, it will get in the way of your business, it gets in the way of your happiness, it gets in the way of your peace and contentment. So it's very much something that I think is worth being aware of and working to tame a little. And so I'm going to wish you a lovely rest of your week. Enjoy some pancakes today if you're doing that. And I'll look forward to speaking with you next week. Take care.